Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Lucas Stevenson, and I'm the coordinator of ICRSE, the International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe. We are a network led by sex workers with a membership of more than 100 organizations working with sex workers or led by sex workers in 35 countries in Europe and Central Asia. So we are very excited to have this webinar today. And first of all, I wanted to thank Julia at Freedom Collaborative for hosting this event. Thank you very much. We are very excited for this partnership. So today we have many speakers, many activists from sex worker organizations working in the region, as well as other experts from the anti-trafficking field, either from a non-governmental organization, academics, authors, etc. I'm actually a bit nervous. That's why I'm coughing. So for us, it's very important, this event, because there's often a divide between some anti-trafficking organization and sex worker rights organization. And as an activist for the rights of sex workers, this is something that I believe shouldn't be the case. I think both anti-trafficking organization and sex worker rights organization have the same goal, which is to prevent violence, prevent exploitation, and prevent trafficking in the sex industry. However, there can be difference of understanding and sometimes of conceptualization of what is trafficking. And often this leads to exclusion of sex workers from anti-trafficking responses, policies, and programs. And this is problematic because it actually limits the impact of anti-trafficking responses and negatively impact the rights of sex workers generally. So we know that in Europe, for the last 20 years or so, a model known as the Swedish model or on-demand model has been implemented in many countries and an increasing number of countries, and is still being promoted as the best response to ending trafficking in the sex industry. However, there is no evidence that this model is working, and it has been condemned by many organizations, including human rights organizations like Amnesty International, public health organizations like WHO, or UNAIDS, and many anti-trafficking organizations, including GATW and Letonde International, who are sitting on this conference today. And of course, it has been denounced by sex workers organizations, including ICRSE and many of its members, who are living under such model. So having said that, I think for us, it's very important to start and engage in conversation about this topic. As I was mentioning earlier, we do have the same end goal of ending exploitation of trafficking in the sex industry. And for us, and I hope this is the message that will come out from this conference today, it is not possible to address this issue without involving those who are the most at risk, and that is sex workers themselves, and in particular, migrant sex workers. So over the last 3 years, ICRSE was able to develop a program that we titled Rights Not Rescue, which is a slogan of the sex worker rights movement. And in this program, we were able to work with 12 sex worker rights organizations in the region, providing small grants to do more activities on empowering migrant sex workers to tackle exploitation and trafficking in the sex industry. So some of these organizations are here today. They will present some of their work. They will present as well how they understand the best way to address exploitation and trafficking in the sex industry, make recommendations, etc. So I won't talk much longer. I really am grateful for all the speakers who joined this panel. And I'm also really grateful for all the people attending this webinar and who are ready to listen to the voices of sex workers and advocates for sex workers' rights. I really hope this will be a first step towards greater collaboration between partners who sometimes find themselves at odds despite fighting for the same goal. So thanks again for joining. I will be chairing the first panel. We then have two other panels with a break at 10:45, I think. We will also share the agenda in the chat, and there will be time for question and answer after each panel that you can type, I think, in the chat. Julia can confirm. So thanks again, and I will now start the first panel. So the first panel is titled, What is the role of sex workers organization in addressing exploitation and trafficking in the sex industry? And on this panel, we have Alejandra Ortiz from SAVE and Trans United Netherlands in the Netherlands. We would then have Nikki Adams from the English Collective of Prostitutes in the UK, Anna Kouroupou from Red Umbrella Athens and Positive Voice in Greece, and Borislav Gerasimov from the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women. And I will now give the microphone to Alejandra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca, and thank you for inviting me today. Let me share my presentation. Very good. So last year, several collectives and organizations in the Netherlands, we worked together on the making of this report, which was auspiced by ICRSE, called The Situation of Migrant Sex Workers in the Netherlands. Now, this project was made in collaboration between, I'll move my slide. Yeah. Between SAFE, which is a sex work-led peer-to-peer support group, Trans United Europe, sex work-led trans empowerment organization, PROUD, which is the Netherlands Sex Workers Union, founded by Mariska Meijer. And we also counted with the help of PNG 292, which is Prostitutes and Gezondheid, the Center for Prostitution and Healthcare in Amsterdam. Now, a little bit about sex work in the Netherlands. Sex work in the Netherlands is legal. It has been legalized, and brothel ban has been lifted since 2000. Now, even though it's legal, each municipality takes care of its own regulations when it comes to giving licenses, because sex work is it works in a system in which it's a business. So most municipalities provide license on their own ruling. Now, it is legal. However, the migrant status of a person affects how legal it is for each person. Dutch and European citizens can request these licenses to work on sex work. For migrant sex workers from outside the European Union, that is not possible unless they already have a European passport. We get to it in a little bit more. Now, the methodology for this report is that we did 32 structured interviews. We included individual interviews and focus groups with cisgender women, cisgender men, and trans sex workers, mostly trans women. The report focused on several aspects, which were work safety, housing, trafficking, police, and stigma. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will only focus on trafficking and police. And you can always read this report in the ICRSE website. So here comes to healthcare, some notes by participants, more notes by participants. Now, when it comes to trafficking, which is, let me start by saying that the Dutch law states that recruiting or bringing sex workers into the country is a crime and can be considered trafficking. Again, sex workers outside the European Union that don't already have a visa cannot get a job permit in the Netherlands to do sex work, which in turn leads to more and more people working on their ground, on their it can sometimes be more dangerous situation, but also to be more targeted by security forces who tend to conflate sex work with trafficking, and thus many times undocumented or unregulated sex workers tend to be seen as victims by the police. What we find on our report from migrant sex workers is that migrant sex workers don't see themselves as victims. Most see themselves as simply migrant workers looking to have an opportunity for a better life. And as you can see here on some of the quotations by people we interview, there's the way migrant sex workers perceive themselves is different than the way Dutch policies perceive them. There's a thin line between forced and voluntary sex work, and this thin line and these complexities are usually not acknowledged when it comes to anti-trafficking policies. And it mostly has to do with the fact that when these policies are being made, sex workers and migrant sex workers are not on the table talks, are not there to talk about how they perceive their own situation and their needs. Now, of course, these inadequate policies lead to this inadequate understanding of how sex work works leads also to really sometimes bad policies. And the point from this slide is very clear. It's important that when policymakers and talk about sex work, they include sex workers and migrant sex workers on the table, and so they can work together. In this point, I want to add that when it comes to trafficking, sex workers know when another person is in trouble. We can tell, and the best way that stakeholders can help is by being in contact with us, with the sex work community. Now, the next topic will be about police. What we find out is that most migrant sex workers don't come in contact with the police because they are distrustful, and they many times feel stigmatized by the police, even in the Netherlands. There's one exception in this case of distrust for police. When the police and sex workers get in contact with each other via PNG 292, the Center for Prostitution and Healthcare, and through other sex workers, or through sex workers organizations such as SAFE, Proud, and TransUnited, then the contact is made easier, and there is more trust in the police. So we completely advise the police and security forces to be in touch with us so we can assist them on how to reach sex workers better. And now there's a lot of stigma, but this part about stigma, you can also read it on our report. And lastly, let's talk about recommendations. The recommendations are very simple. We need to have full decriminalization of sex work, but also for non-European migrant sex workers, because this is the only way that people don't go on the ground and fall victims to trafficking. And the other thing is, when you talk about sex work, it's important to have migrant sex workers also on the table to talk about our issues and how to tackle the problems better. And another point here is to provide affordable housing, safe workspaces, and make it easier to work from home, which in the Netherlands, if you are legal to do sex work, you can work from home, but you cannot advertise. So there's topics for another talk. And it's important to bring a positive and representation of sex workers, and not just as victims, but just as any person. And we need to better train the police and policymakers and lawyers and stakeholders on how to approach sex workers. And of course, very important, we need to continue to have collaboration between sex work-led organizations, allies such as PNG 292, with the police, with policymakers, and with other stakeholders. So again, you can read our full report in the ICRSE website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandra, for the presentation. I will post the link to the report in the chat. I think what you're mentioning is really important, and I also wanted to point that Trans United Europe is currently organizing a conference that looking at issues such as housing and access to the labor market for trans migrant people, which is also a critical issue in looking at addressing root causes of vulnerabilities and exploitation, which are for many trans people lack of access to education, lack of access to regular migration route, etc. I will send a link about the conference as well. And our next speaker is Nikki Adams from the English Collective of Prostitutes, who is going to speak now. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. Yes, I'm from the English Collective of Prostitutes, which is a network of sex workers working both on the street and together and inside premises and in various other areas of the sex industry. We are migrant and non-migrant women. There's a very active group of migrant sex workers in our organisation who have been spearheading campaigns against arrests, against police illegality and racism, and deportations, which have really escalated since the Brexit referendum. And they're sorry that they aren't able to present here today. I wanted to say three things about the context of the issue of trafficking and sex work and access to justice specifically. The first is that in the UK and probably throughout Europe and in many other countries of the world, there is an epidemic of violence against women generally. I mean, that's what we're facing, and that's the context of us discussing what are we going to do about violence against sex work. But it's got to the point now, partly because there's a very lively movement against violence against women, which has really kind of been invigorated in the last couple of months since the murder of a particular woman, Sarah Everard. And that has really opened up the whole discussion so that people are speaking now about the fact that rape in the UK has effectively been decriminalised, that the percentage of rape reports that actually end in conviction is minuscule. And so it's important for us to remember that, because it's important in terms of solutions, because realistically, we will not win protection for sex workers against violence without all women and all people really addressing violence, the high levels of violence in the society. The thing that's striking about that movement is that the police came under a lot of criticism, and there's a very big move against the police having more powers to under a new piece of legislation called a police bill. And that's also useful for us as sex workers, because a lot of the argument we have, or the fight that we've been involved in, is against proposals to increase police powers, supposedly under the guise of addressing violence against sex workers. The other context, which I'm sure is true for everybody else on this call, is that the pandemic has massively increased destitution and devastated people's lives. And for us as sex workers, that means that we're working under really more repressive conditions. And the police have used legislation under the Coronavirus Act to target sex workers, and everybody's having to take more risks in order to earn an income. And finally, my third point in terms of context is that there's been a rampant expansion of low-waged, exploitative, precarious work with no labour right protection. And so if as sex workers we're considering what our options are, the other options are looking worse and worse. And we have to remember that many women in particular go into sex work to escape violence, including domestic violence and exploitation and abuse and low wages, which are rampant in the other jobs commonly done by women. So as I said, for migrant sex workers, the violence did get worse after the Brexit vote. The police racism really increased. We have information, we have a whole campaign on our website, which I'll post the link afterwards, of a dossier which documents some of those injustices, a film that we made as a result, our Know Your Rights sheet, and other information that people might find useful. But the police are still acting illegally, stopping women on the street in particular, taking people's papers, your passport, saying that they won't give it back to you until women can show a ticket back home, targeting women for arrest and then deporting them as persistent offenders, which means that you get a lot of convictions for soliciting. And then once you have 6 convictions for soliciting, they can use that to deport you. But as I said, there has been a big fight against this, and we have successfully stopped a number of prosecutions and removals. I'd like to just say that when we're thinking of how to tackle trafficking, which is now really being characterised in the UK as an issue of modern slavery, we have to remember that it's not that trafficking is unique and different from anything else that's going on. It's often on a spectrum that of sex workers' experience that ranges from what's called decent work, which is actually defined, right the way through to severe exploitation and abuse. And for us, the question is what, for us as sex workers, what power do we have to protect ourselves and demand that our rights aren't violated? And the criminalisation that comes from the prostitution laws undermines that power. They undermine our safety by forcing us to work in isolation and preventing us from coming forward to report violence. And it undermines all the practical safety measures that we would want to put in place, like working together, taking down the details of clients and telling someone where we're going when we're working, installing CCTV, closed circuit television in our premises. The fact is, though, is that despite all that, we're working very hard to keep ourselves safe and to defend ourselves against all kinds of exploitation and violence. But all the safety measures that we're trying to implement as sex workers are being undermined by the laws, and that attack has been heightened since this big move now to actually try and criminalise clients, which I'll just say something about in a minute. So most of the raids that go on in the UK now are done under the guise of modern slavery, which means it's a big fabrication and a big scam, really, that the police will go in under the guise of saving victims of trafficking. They will report in the press that women are taken to a place of safety or that they were saved. We know the inside story of those raids because a lot of the women that are picked up in those raids are actually part of our network, part of our kind of organising core. And it's migrant sex workers who do not identify as victims. And when they say taken to a place of safety or saved, often that means scrutinised and investigated. And if they have anything on you, then threatened with arrest and deportation. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing day in, day out. So one example is, there's a lot of robberies against brothels at the moment because people think there's money there. And so they've become a particular target, always, but it's got worse. And in one recent robbery, I mean, we've reported on a lot over the times, but this recent one, again, followed the same pattern where women are threatened by very violent men. In this case, they did have weapons. And when they reported it to the police, initially the police take it seriously. As soon as they realise that the premises is a brothel under the law, more than one woman working together in premises, then the investigation shifts from the violent men onto the women. And it's the women that get questioned and investigated, sex workers that get questioned and investigated. How many clients do you have? How much money do you earn? Who do you work for? All those kind of details which show that the priority is to investigate the brothel rather than the violence. And so in most cases, the victims code is not followed. The National Police Chief guidelines here, which say that sex workers should be treated as victims rather than criminals, is ignored. And this has got worse in the last year, I would say, despite the pandemic, when a lot of people were either trying not to work or having to work very underground. And it's got worse because there's been an onslaught by Labour women politicians trying to criminalise clients. It's based on a mass of false information about modern slavery and trafficking and sensationalism about so-called pop-up brothels, which are short-term brothels. They're short-term often because you can't stay in the same location for long because you get threatened by the police to move on. And all this has really served to justify increased raids and crackdowns. There's been a big campaign against that move by Labour women MPs, and an organisation, Decrim Now, which we're part of, distributed an open letter which was signed by hundreds of people, hundreds of organisations, demanding that against the imposition of a Nordic model legislation. I'd like to just say one quick thing about the services for victims of trafficking, because you would think that with all this information about trafficking, that where sex workers are genuinely in situations of severe exploitation and trafficking and want to escape, there would be help. But there is really very, very little. We've worked with a number of women trying to go through the national referral mechanism. Generally, it's time limited and you don't get help to claim asylum, which is the only basis in which you can actually apply to stay in the UK permanently, not as an EU citizen, but as somebody outside the EU. And then the services are not enough, and they're really not good enough. Women who, for example, need housing are told there is nothing or pushed from one privatised agency to another. And many of the voluntary organisations are not doing their job. They appear to primarily be there, from our point of view, to manage our expectations and to be a gatekeeper between us and the resources that we need. So really, I'd like to finish by saying that if people are concerned about harm to women and against violence against sex workers, then you should be concerned with the harm that is being caused to us by both the prostitution laws and the anti-trafficking laws. The laws are used in a severely discriminatory way to target migrant, trans and women of colour, who are then targeted for arrest and deportation. The couple of initiatives that we have that we're trying to address these issues is that we have a campaign for an amnesty from arrest for victims of violence, which I can say more about if people are interested. We're demanding that the police chief guidelines are strengthened to specify that arrests and raids should only occur where the police have reasonable grounds to suspect that sex workers are being subjected to force and coercion. We're demanding that violence against women and girls strategies must not include prostitution define prostitution as a form of violence, because that characterises sex workers as victims rather than as protagonists in our own struggle and lives. And then we're demanding no Nordic model, no legislation to criminalise clients, and that trafficking law, policy and initiatives focus on the criminal acts of force and coercion and threats and actual violence, and not be used as a justification for raids and arrests and deportation. And finally, we think we have to find ways to come together, as Luca outlined at the beginning, that we have to come together, we think, to tackle the root causes of prostitution, which is poverty, the hostile immigration environment against migrants, and exploitative labour conditions in many industries. One solution we're focused on is demanding a care income, which would put money in women's hands for the work we're already doing, and change what we feel able to demand, starting with refusing all exploitative jobs, including those in the sex industry. We think it's a demand that we can come together on, and we would welcome people's support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and thanks to all the work that the English Collective of Prostitutes have been doing since the 70s, actually, one of the oldest sex worker-led organizations in Europe. I think many of the points are going to be echoed by other speakers, including the importance to look at root causes of vulnerability and actually entry into prostitution for many people. So the next speaker is Anna Kouroupou from Greece, which will be joined by Eliza as well. I'll let you start your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna. I speak in my language because I want to speak well. And Eliza, help me for that, okay?
I'm Elisa Goroya. I'm the advocacy and comms person for Positive Voice. I will be translating for Anna, and then I will add a couple of points in regards to research.
Λοιπόν, εδώ στην Ελλάδα έχουμε νομοθεσία που
Here in Greece, with the legislation,
νόμιμη πορνεία, όπως τη λέει ο νόμος.
Sex work is legal and regulated.
Sex work, πορνεία.
Prostitution, sex work is defined as prostitution in the law.
It's not, όχι εργασία, μακάρι να το είχε εργασία. And το πρόβλημα είναι ότι αυτός ο νόμος δεν είναι σε ισχύ, έχει πολλές παγίδες μέσα.
The issue is that the legal framework cannot be implemented because there are so many parameters defining how this could be legal that it actually makes it impossible for sex workers to have permission by the government.
Ζητάει 52 δικαιολογητικά χαρτιά για να μπορέσει να δουλέψεις σε εικονοχής.
For example, there are 52 steps and paperwork processes that are necessary for you to be able to work in a brothel.
Εάν καταφέρεις να τα βγάλεις, που πολλές καταφέρνουμε και τα έχουμε.
If you manage to overcome this paperwork procedure, and some of the sex workers manage,
δεν μπορείς να δουλέψεις σε κάποιο χώρο γιατί απαγορεύεται να δουλεύεις και στο χώρο και σε ανοιχτό και παντού. Είναι τρελό.
It's almost impossible to work in a closed space or in the streets. Everywhere, as Anna says, it is crazy.
Αυτός είναι ο κύριος λόγος που το trafficking έχει πάρει τεράστιες διαστάσεις στη χώρα μας.
This is one of the most important reasons why trafficking is such a huge issue in Greece.
Και αν βάλουμε μέσα και το μεταναστευτικό, που η Ελλάδα είναι η χώρα που έχει τη μεγαλύτερη προσέλευση αυτών, καταλαβαίνετε πόσο μεγάλο είναι το πρόβλημα του trafficking, ενώ αυτών μεταναστών.
Adding to this is the current geopolitical position of Greece in terms of the refugee and migrant population. So this is again amplifying the issue of trafficking in Greece.
Οπότε η νομοθεσία αυτή λοιπόν, ενώ η εργασία είναι νόμιμη, στην ουσία βοηθάει τους traffickers να προσεγγίζουν πιο εύκολα τα πρόσωπα και τα άτομα που θέλουν να εργαστούν.
So, although this kind of work is considered legal, the framework is actually helping traffickers to continue their work.
Από την άλλη, έχουμε έναν πάρα πολύ καλό anti-trafficking νόμο, ο οποίος όμως δεν μπαίνει ποτέ σε εφαρμογή.
On the other hand, we have a quite expansive and good anti-trafficking law, but this law is also not implemented.
Άρα τα τελευταία 30-40 χρόνια που θυμάμαι τον εαυτό μου, είμαστε πάντα έρμεα κάθε κυβέρνησης που μας λένε ότι αυτό θα αλλάξει και ποτέ δεν αλλάζει.
The last 30 to 40 years, as long as I remember myself, we feel like we are the victims of the government that tells us this is going to change, but it doesn't.
Τα τελευταία 5 χρόνια είμαστε οι μοναδικοί προς το παρόν. Εύχομαι να είναι και άλλες οργανώσεις που ασχολούμαστε ανοιχτά και δυναμικά για την εργασία στο σεξ.
In the last 5 years, Red Umbrella Athens is the sole structure and organization in Greece that is openly working to empower and support sex workers. Of course, I hope this will change.
Τι θέλω να πω τώρα. Τον τελευταίο χρόνο, πριν σκάσει η πανδημία, ο Υπουργός, δεν έχει σημασία να πω το όνομά του, από την κυβέρνηση μας κάλεσε να συζητήσουμε για τη λύση ενός νέου νομοσχεδίου με την βοήθειά μας.
Last year, we were invited by the minister to discuss legislative reform regarding sex work, but this has not moved forward. Βρεθήκαμε, είπαμε τις προτάσεις μας, ήταν πολύ θετική η όλη ανταπόκριση, αλλά έσκασε η πανδημία μετά και μην ξεχνάμε ότι είναι μια δεξιά κυβέρνηση, οπότε δεν ξέρουμε τι συνέχεια θα έχει αυτή η ιστορία. Although we met with the minister, then the pandemic occurred, and similarly to other issues, this was left aside. And now we have no idea how this is going to move forward. And also keep in mind, this is a conservative government right now, so we don't really have a clear idea how things are going to change in the near future.
Οπότε δεν έχω και πολλά να σας πω για την κατάσταση. Είμαστε 1 χρόνο περίπου παρακάτω μήνες δεν εργαζόμασταν, δεν μπορούσαμε. Είχαμε απογορευτικό έως τις 8 από τις 8 το βράδυ, 9-6.
I couldn't speak more right now because for a whole year we haven't been able to work. There have been very strict restrictions in terms of movement. We had to stay inside sometimes as early as 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m.
Όχι μόνο εμείς, όλος ο κόσμος. Επίσης με το μεταναστευτικό δεν υπάρχει μεγάλη πληροφορία, διότι λόγω της πανδημίας πάλι τους μαζέψανε όλους σε camps και είναι πολύ δύσκολα τα πράγματα και για αυτούς ακόμη περισσότερο.
This restriction was not just for sex workers, but the whole population of Greece. And in regards to the refugee and immigrant populations, they were also affected, and they were stricter restrictions imposed on them, with open camps being turned into closed camps.
Mm-hmm. Αυτά έχω να σας πω. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Να μιλήσει τώρα η Ελίζα.
That's all from me. Let Elisa speak. I'm just going to add one final thing in regards to our research, that out of a sample of 100 women street workers that came through our structure, we found that 80 out of 100 did not have permission to work, which is a very clear image of what is actually happening, that the legal framework is actually not corresponding to the reality and the needs of sex workers, again, leaving them further vulnerable to traffickers and exploitation. So our approach is to have a sex worker-led structure that is responsive to the needs that arise from the people that walk through themselves, and we keep expanding the services towards that direction. And we're trying to push for legislative reform, again, including sex workers, especially Anna, who is a prominent activist here in Greece, and always trying to focus on the importance of inclusion of sex workers themselves in every step of the way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna and Eliza. That was very clear. I think the research will also be available in English. We can forward it to the participants. And I think what the point you were making around like legalization is really critical. There's often a misunderstanding about what sex workers want. And when we demand the decriminalization of sex work, it is very different than demanding legalization. We see Greece as an example where prostitution is legal, where sex work is legal, but in practice, it means that the majority of sex workers work illegally and are facing various forms of like legal oppression, which leads like to issues in relation to reporting to the police when there are crimes. And one of the points that you were mentioning as well, that we hope to work more as well in ICRSE, is on the issue of like refugees who are engaged in sex work. So we know this is the case for many refugees, and this is an issue that is not discussed enough within our movement and through with other partners as well. So I know Red Umbrella Athens and many organizations today are also working with refugees who sell sex, and we hope to continue working on this topic. And the final speaker for this panel is Borislav Gerasimov from the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women. Borislav, I'll let you speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oka. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much to ICRSE for inviting me to speak at this event. So first, I want to mention that our organization, or GATW as we pronounce it, has always been an ally of sex workers ever since we were formed in 1994. And the reason for this is quite simple and logical from our perspective. In short, it's because sex workers are a group of predominantly women, but also men, trans people, non-binary, and others who are marginalized and who are oppressed and discriminated in society. But still, they organize and they fight for their rights, and they fight against discrimination, against criminalization, and for decent working conditions. And it's this kind of collective struggle and fight for rights which we think has the ability to counter exploitative working conditions in any industry, and including exploitative working conditions, including trafficking and other abuses in any industry, and of course, including in the sex industry, and not only. And I will only share here in the chat, I sent a little piece we had written about sort of the history of GATW and why we partner with sex worker organizations, or why we consider sex worker organizations as important in our joint struggle against trafficking and for rights and justice. And the other thing I want to mention, which is specifically related to the topic of the webinar today, is it's sort of going to echo what other speakers said before me. So in 2018, so 3 years ago, we published a report based on research among 7 sex worker organizations in different countries, and these countries were Canada, Mexico, Spain, South Africa, India, Thailand, and New Zealand. And our aim was to document how sex worker organizations and sex workers assist people in the sex industry who experience a range of abuses, some of which may be, may be related to trafficking. And our aim in doing so was what Alejandra said in the beginning, that sex workers know who among their peers and other sex workers have problems and what kinds of problems they have. And they are very often in the best position to help them with these problems. And similarly with sex worker organizations who are in the street, who are in the communities, and who are often the point of contact or the first point of contact for sex workers with problems. And I will also share here the link to that publication. But in short, we found that all the 7 organizations who participated in our project do provide assistance to, broadly speaking, to sex workers with problems. And some of these problems could be, trafficking or exploitation. Some of them could be, let's say, less severe, even though I don't want to measure, problems in terms of severity. But these problems could be, with other issues, all kinds of problems. So some of the organizations, for example, in India or Mexico, framed their work specifically as anti-trafficking work. Other organizations preferred to stay away from the trafficking framework because it's being used very often to cause harm to sex workers and sex worker organizations. But in many cases, they were offering assistance with where to work, or how much to charge, how to find clients, how to stay safe, and also how to find other work for sex workers who wanted to leave the sex industry for a variety of reasons. So all of these services were provided by sex worker organizations, and I have to say many of these services, when they are provided by anti-trafficking organizations, they would be called anti-trafficking services, such as help with where and how to work and under what conditions, or support with filing, for example, support with immigration issues, or with reporting violence to the police, or support with finding another job. So, in short, what our research documented was that sex worker organizations are should be seen as allies in anti-trafficking work, and this kind of work should be supported by anti-trafficking organizations and institutions, at the national or international level, and donors who provide funding for anti-trafficking work. So I will stop here, and I will be happy to take any questions later if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Borislav. And this closes our first panel. We now have a little bit of time for questions and answers, but of course we are already running a little bit late. So we have one question here from Tetiana Rudenko. Whoever wants to respond, please respond from the first panel. As a number of colleagues have mentioned that sex workers know when another person is in trouble, do you happen to have the data on how many presumed cases of trafficking were reported by sex workers in any given period of time, and to whom they were reported? Thank you. I'm not sure if anyone feels able to answer this question. Maybe. What I can say is that we don't have any specific. Nikki wants to answer. That's
no, well, I think I'm about to say what you were about to say, which is that the figures on trafficking are very, very difficult to unravel. I know that Emily, who's going to be speaking later, has looked into this in great detail. But from our experience, we've been through 2 big police operations, anti-trafficking operations, which were reported both by the police and by the press as finding hundreds, literally 450 victims. But then when a very kind of forensic analysis was done of that, it was only 15 cases where people were actually investigated for trafficking. And of those, there was only 5 where there was some kind of force or coercion, trafficking in the way that people would understand. And we've been subject to the most horrific misrepresentation. At some point, some labor politician was saying that there were 25,000 victims trafficked into the sex industry a year, which is ludicrous. And the police were coming out with statements that 4,000 victims were being trafficked, and they were including women that were actually in our network that were organising with us to defend their rights against criminalisation and deportation. So I think it's a very fraught area, and it's really a symptom of the problem that we're up against, which is the misrepresentation of what's going on and the conflation of migrant sex workers with victims of trafficking.
Thank you, Nikki. And Borislav?
Thank you, Oka. Yes, I agree with that. The question is framed in a very, let's say, bureaucratic way in terms of trafficking, like, okay, how many were presumed, how many were confirmed? When, for the person who has problems, the important thing is that their problem is resolved, whether they are referred specifically, to be registered as a presumed or confirmed victim of trafficking or not. But in our research, we have two examples from South Africa, one which was the largest ever uncovered case of trafficking for exploitation in South Africa, which was uncovered by the sex worker organization while they were doing outreach work on the street. And another one was several cases from India where, young women who were brought to the brothels were just by the system, let's say, that sex worker organizations have in India to sort of monitor the newcomers to the brothels and to interview them and find out, how they came there. So this was another way. But we don't have specific numbers, and certainly not from Europe.
Thank you very much. Just a small answer to this as well is that ICRSE, as part of this Rights Not Rescue program, we developed this research on migrant sex workers' access to justice, which is available on our website. And in this report, we also analyzed 50 cases of sex workers victims of violence, exploitation, trafficking, and other crimes. And we saw one of the findings is that for many sex workers, reporting to the police is simply not possible. We know that reporting to the police is very difficult already for many marginalized communities, whether they're like undocumented migrants, trans people, people who use drugs, etc. And when the stigma and the criminalization of sex work is associated with it, it makes it really, really difficult. One of the enabling factors in reporting was the involvement of a friendly sex worker organization, whether sex worker-led or service provider that was not judgmental. In this case, sex workers felt they were more able to report the crime to the police. And I think this is very important for us to point at the role of sex worker organization in reporting crime. We have another, the question is answered now. I've lost the question. Oops. Yes, there was a question that was answered live, but I will just still mention it, and then we will pass to the next panel from Empower Foundation in Thailand. Has there been any recording of experiences when applying for visa? The process is very racist, and we often have to pay an agent before we even go to the embassy. Do you feel that if independent travel was easier, it will be safer? Maybe somebody wants to answer this question.
Can I just mention, I don't want to answer the whole question because the question, yes, it's there's massive problems with visas coming into the UK. And yes, if people could travel legally, it would really make a big difference. But I only really wanted to say that Empower is a sex worker organization in Thailand, and they've done a brilliant report, which I really recommend that people read, which is called Hit and Run, which is written obviously from the point of view of sex workers in Thailand, many of whom want to cross international borders and who document the harm caused by anti-trafficking laws and policies and have really fantastic recommendations for change. So I really recommend everybody have a look at that.
Thank you, absolutely. And I think for ICRSE and many of its members, one of the key demands is that migrants who want to travel to Europe should have like regular, easy access to work permit, etc. Because the difficulty to cross border is one of the main reasons people engage with third parties and exploiters in the first place. And we know this is an issue not just in the sex industry, but for migrants in general, which is why ICRSE works closely with PICUM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, who also support a rights-based approach to fighting trafficking, including the decriminalization of sex work and access to safe channel for migration. So this will be the end of our first panel. Thanks again to all the speakers. Thanks to the questions. Feel free to continue asking questions. You will not hear from me anymore as we have an amazing moderator and chairs for the next panels. And I leave it now to Emily, I think, who will present. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Luca. So bang on time, which is great. So this second panel is titled Challenges and Opportunities in the Inclusion of Sex Workers in Anti-Trafficking Responses. And we're going to hear from 3 representatives of sex worker organizations from Europe, and then a 4th view from a pan-European perspective. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker and get underway. I'd just like to say, if you can keep what you're saying to 7 minutes or less, that would be wonderfully helpful to me with this tight time. I'd appreciate it. And if I send you a notification to wrap up, please do so. So we're going to go first to Hermine from the Committee for the Civil Rights of Prostitutes in Italy, if you're ready.
Hello, thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thank you, ICRSE, for inviting me on this important panel. So I will go straight away to share my slide, my presentation, and in order to keep into 7 minutes. So let me do it. Okay. Now, I represent the Committee for the Civil Rights of Prostitutes, and we're based in Trieste, northeast Italy, which has become very, very popular because it represents the entry into Italy from the Balkans, from East European Europe. Now, the committee has been active for the past 40 years. How do I go on? Yeah. For the past 40 years as a sex worker-led organization that was founded in 1983, and it already started working on the recognition, demanding the recognition of sex work, and by engaging policymakers to have an approach in a policy based on the human rights of sex workers. The committee also has always demanded access, the guarantee of access to health services for sex workers, the end of violence perpetrated against sex workers by law force orders, and by other agents also on the territory. And it has always considered empowerment as a key strategies for services that are being offered to sex workers. Now, although the committee is a sex worker-led organization and has worked for the past 40 years, it is also for the last 20 years, and this year marks the 20th year as a sex worker-led organization in the anti-trafficking, National Anti-Trafficking Panel in Italy. So it started, 1990 represented a turning point when sex workers on the streets in Italy realized that some of the migrant women that were present alongside with them were being forced into sex work. And that's why I put prostitution here. They were being forced into sex work. And what our organization did was to clearly distinguish sex work, independent sex work, and forceful or coerced sex work. And it advocated for the legislators to adopt human rights-based legislation in order to protect those persons who didn't choose to do sex work or who were there against their will and who were in a condition of slavery or exploitation. This also led committee to be among the panel, the national panel that was consulted for the adoption of an anti-trafficking policy in Italy, which has been in place since the 1990s. let's see, yeah, since the 1990s, when the Turco-Napolitano law was adopted. This law was based from, let's say, had a judicial point of view, but those were the first considerations on victims of human trafficking. And then in 1998 came the Article 18, which was specific for the identification and the protection of trafficked and exploited persons in Italy. Law 11 of 2003 has also a judicial perspective on trafficking of persons, and it is against criminals and criminal organizations. This is just to say that there are a number of legislations that look into trafficking of persons and also the protection of those victims or persons who have been trafficked into exploitation. And I wouldn't limit this only to sexual exploitation. And this is the important point in our work and discourse, in the sense that in the early 2000s, around 2005, this discourse, there was a problem. There was a problem of identifying persons who had been trafficked into exploitation, who have been trafficked and who are being forced into sex work. Now, it was important for us as a sex worker-led organization to pinpoint the difference, to distinguish who a victim is of trafficking, of exploitation, and who has chosen to work independently as a sex worker. Our organization has always been very clear about this. We condemn the phenomenon of trafficking, but at the same time, and this seems absurd, but at the same time, we stand for the rights of sex workers and for their recognition of their work as labor. The Article 18, which is, I think, it's one of the best laws that guarantees the rights of a person who has been trafficked and exploited, but not only in sex work, and who has been exploited also in other forms of labor, guarantees the possibility to have a residence permit, which can be converted into a work permit or a study permit. It permits a person to re-establish his or her migratory project, and civil society and NGOs are being involved in this process. So there is the work that is being done alongside with persons who have been trafficked is based on a human rights approach. At least this is what we adopt in our work here in Trieste. Now, it may appear that everything seems really nice and fantastic, but then we have some problems. So this is why it is important for us to have a sex worker-led organization in the anti-trafficking system, because we have a deep knowledge of the working conditions of the sex workers. We can see to the correct adoption of policies that ensure that the sex workers' rights are guaranteed, that the migrant person can choose to do sex work, and that we can also bring into the correct identification of who is a victim or who is an exploited migrant in the labor market, and I include sex work in that. So what are the challenges? Now the challenges are these. Exploitation should be, and this has to be reminded all the time, exploitation is a global phenomenon that is present in all sectors and fields of economy. So it is not only in sex work. Now, for example, we have 180,000 persons who are exploited in agriculture in Italy, and just 30% of them are women. So why do we talk only of exploitation in sex work? Then there is this leads to the conflation of trafficking of persons as victims of sexual exploitation. And the criminalization of clients also diverges from the significant actions that have to be taken to combat human trafficking and criminal organizations. And it also increases the vulnerability of migrant persons who are forced to work in hidden areas in order to avoid penalization. Then last but not least, restrictive migration policies forcefully push migrants towards criminal organizations who are engaged in trafficking and also in the exploitation of persons. So just before I end up, what do we want? What do we ask for from EU institutions? We remind them that migrants without legal papers are vulnerable by definition. Why do we say this? We say this because if we had better migration policies, then we would be able to grant migrants the right to work, the right to migrate, the right to work in the sex industry, and also to have access to health care. This year, the 2020 plus 2021 has shown us from lessons that we've, as sex worker-led organizations, have been able to see that sex workers were not able to work last year and neither this year. There are lots of restrictions which do not allow them to go out on the streets to offer their services. So what do we need? We need open policies towards sex workers and not restrictions, but not only sex workers, but migrants in general. We need to have decriminalization of all modes of conduct that are considered as illegal. And one of the things is the abetting for sex workers, that is favoreggiamento, which impedes sex workers to work and which also impedes sex workers to unionize, to work together. We have to incorporate sex worker organizations in all fields and all institutional tables in order to plan actions that are aimed to improve sex workers' conditions, but also adopt correct empowerment strategies. I will stop now, Emily. And then the last point was on funding to sex worker-led organizations in order to provide continued aid to sex workers in need. And these are lessons that we learned this year in 2020, 2021, in order to be able to sustain sex workers who have been excluded from all forms of support, emergency support. This is just a brief outline of the bibliography, recent bibliography. And then we have this umbrella, the red umbrella, and a greeting from Pia Covre. 2021 also marks the 20 years of the red umbrella, which is now a global symbol for the demand of sex workers' rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hermine. We're now going to go to Maxime from the UTSOPI in Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks ICRSE for the invitation. So I'm Maxime Mas, the director of UTSOPI. UTSOPI is an organization existing since December 2015 and the first organization by and for sex workers in Belgium, self-organized and fighting for their rights. Our main mission are the defense of the right of sex workers in Belgium and the creation of a community space for exchange and resources for sex workers, and also an advisory and guidance mission for people wishing to declare themselves or work as a sex worker in Belgium. So in 2019, we launched a project called Migration and Anti-Trafficking in the framework of the Right Not Rescue project led by ICRSE. And thank you for that once again. So in general, the idea for UTSOPI was to be able to develop its expertise and knowledge on issues on human trafficking and smuggling, and also to be able to integrate people who are victims of trafficking or smuggling within the organization. Our first mission was to fully understand this phenomena because we believe in UTSOPI that we can collectively provide specific solutions with civil society only when we manage to identify problems in a precise and specific way. So a large part of the project focused on creating a bond of trust with migrant sex workers. At first glance, UTSOPI wasn't well known in this district and often assimilating only to the white people or privileged sex workers of the neighborhoods. It was therefore necessary to do a long, meticulous field work to meet the people whom they get to know us and give us a beginning of confidence in spite of preconception. Most of the project was due to start concretely in 2020, but as you know, we have to modify it somewhat, where we want to put in place a real and strong inclusion and empowerment of sex workers. The coronavirus crisis prevailed. However, through the distribution, ICRSE met more than 400 sex workers, an overwhelming majority of whom are migrant sex workers, around 75%, working in the specific district in the north of Brussels or not. I didn't say, but the project was focused at the beginning in a specific district in Brussels. So the distribution was also a moment to discuss and create a solid bond of trust between sex workers and the community, because many saw the interest of ICRSE and the importance of having a service directed and intended by and for sex workers. Since then, 15 migrant sex workers have joined ICRSE as an affiliated member and 3 people as full member. So it's been really involved in the daily decision process. The majority of these people, 14 out of 15, come from human trafficking or smuggling network. Also, ICRSE was able to create a new strong partnership, in particular, with organizations fighting against human trafficking, particularly Pagaza in Brussels, or PAIOK in the Flanders region, or Syria in Wallonia. So it's all official anti-trafficking organization in Belgium. And the objective for these next few years is to continue to deepen this partnership in order to have a real approach to the trafficking and smuggling of human beings in Belgium. We also created a new partnership with Child Focus, which mainly fight with missing underage people, and therefore sometimes has to deal with issues related to sex work. ICRSE was also solicited on 2 interventions with organizations for the protection of underage people in order to discuss with them the issue of prostitution, sex work among underage people housed in their center. Because of the project, we continue also to consolidate and create new links with local policymakers, also at the region of Brussels or the region of Flanders, and also at the federal government, with the federal government, like, for example, during the last years, we were solicited for the deconfinement and protocol project, which is in a part related with trafficking and smuggling issues, because we are thinking the people most exposed to the risk and clandestinity, it's often migrant sex worker and or victim of trafficking and smuggling. So yeah, it was interested to have this input on the protocol for reopening of sex works. And finally, ICRSE continued to communicate and collaborate in a certain way with the police anti-trafficking units. So it's important to underline here that these specific units in Belgium are not in any way in a repressive approach, but in an approach of victim protection. In addition, ICRSE never disclosed private information about the sector or the sex worker themselves, of course. Our relation consists of the exchange of information. So basically, ICRSE communicates the reality of the ground, any problems, and the police provide ICRSE certain necessary information. Like it was really useful during the last years with the coronavirus crisis, because they warned us when the other unit of the police planned to do a repressive mission online, for example. And the sex workers should therefore be careful with their announcements. So it was very useful. Currently, ICRSE is developing a safe reporting system with the local police. since many sex workers doesn't trust the police, and this for legitimate reason, in my opinion. They refrain from filing a complaint in the event of violence. We have therefore developed a system that allows sex workers to come and file a complaint by appointment directly at the ICRSE's office, where the police come also to take the complaint. This specific point has the advantage, for example, we don't have any cell any jail at the ICRSE office, of course, because we are not a police station. So the sex workers feel more confident and agree to file a complaint in case of assault. This tool is still being processing in the sense that it has only been used 3 times so far, and it's necessary to establish a precise protocol, making it possible to clarify the procedure and the objective for each stakeholders, because what we've seen, it wasn't totally clear between the police process and the ICRSE process how we can work together. But we believe this is an example of good practice for the future for sex workers. And it's the end, Emily. Obviously, as with the rest of our mission, everything remains to be done. This is only the beginning, and the real inclusion of migrant sex workers in this issue that concern them requires a recognized effort and an adaptation of our own practices. We have to adapt about language, access or not in IT technologies, and probably adapt our existing system to make it understandable easier by migrant sex workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxime. We're now going to go to Trajche from Red Edition in Austria.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you to ICRSE for organizing this important event. And I would say that this was a very good example how sex work organizations across Europe can get engaged in such important and huge research and project led by ICRSE. So I'm representing here Red Edition, migrant sex work organization from Vienna, from Austria. We are a pretty small organization existing for 4 years. Core of our activities are basically community action, helping to the community, organizing events with and for the community. But also working on advocating for rights for sex workers in Austria, especially for migrant sex workers. I saw that it was some questions there about some data and some reports produced by sex workers in this topic. But I will say also here, in our point of view from Red Edition, we are not so often working on developing or producing some reports or research. And there is a two point what I want to share with all of you why we are not doing this. The first point is lack of funding for the sex work community organization. Because to produce this kind of documents and to work on this kind of deep research, we need firstly to build our capacities, but of course we need funding, and then to develop and work with possibly also with professionals on these topics. So lack of funding and of course building of capacities, what is also closely connected. In terms of the project's Rights Not Rescue led by ICRSE, Red Edition was worked closely together in partnership with LEFA, service providing organization in Austria, in Vienna. And I would say that this was also a great experience where LEFA is one service providing organization who exists more than 25 years in Vienna. And they have, of course, more expertise on topic of trafficking, and with Red Edition community experience, we together work on the project. Our part, shortly, I will just explain what Red Edition was concretely work in the frame of this project. we was working on organizing and interviewing in deep interview with sex workers, with community on the question of the trafficking. In our findings, of course, you can, the link of the report was already shared, but findings in national level from our community is that access to justice is really struggling point for the sex workers. And there's a couple of points why. Because of the experiences, because of the fear that most of the sex workers who want to access justice or to report any cases, it's existing the fear that they will be targeted through anti-immigration policy and anti-immigration law in the country in terms policy to really target the case what the sex workers are reporting. So here also, I would say that speaking about trafficking, I mean, I want to say that I want to speak and I want to see the big picture of this topic when we're speaking about trafficking. And I strongly believe that speaking in this topic, we cannot go without recognizing the work as work. I think that this is the goal of both sides. We cannot speaking about exploitation without speaking about recognition of labor rights for sex workers. So this is the goal what we need to reach in the future. Recognition, sex workers' work, and accepting the labor rights for sex workers, and then easily we can tackle with any exploitation related to this activity as a work. So changing the law and changing the policy targeting sex workers in the recognition of the labor rights for sex workers, I think it's important for the both sides. I forget maybe to say in the beginning, for the Austria case, we have in Austria where sex work is legalized. What I will say that it's some kind of backdoor criminalization. And we again speaking for some part of some activities in terms of the sex work where they are still criminalized. And as Luca said on the beginning, the model what we as a sex work movement are fighting for is decriminalization and recognition as sex work as work in the future. And I will say again, and I will stop here. If you have any questions, just please let me know. But I think that this is the goal and this is the big picture, recognition, sex work as work, and then we can tackle or we can work on the exploitation. What is in general, the big picture, exploitation it's happening in any workplaces, especially related to migrants' jobs in Europe. Especially we have this kind of problem. And exploitation in general, I will say it's problem of the capitalism, what we can target, of course, with recognition of work and rights for the workers, rights for the migrants, and of course, rights for the sex workers. Thank you to all. And if you have any question, let me know.
Thank you very much. And exactly, we're going to go to the final speaker. But before we do, just a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A box because we'll come to them after hearing from Suzanne from La Strada International.
Thanks a lot, and I hope you can hear me clear. It's very good to speak after the sex workers' rights organizations, because for La Strada International, we are now uniting, maybe not every one of you knows, but we're now uniting 30 NGOs in 23 European countries. We've always focused in particular on trafficking for sexual exploitation. This has been a major focus of our attention and our work, and that of our members, of course, since our establishment already back as a project initially back in 1995. We have conducted strong advocacy and raised awareness to address trafficking for sexual exploitation, and our members have existed until today thousands of persons that have been trafficked for sexual exploitation and other forms of exploitation over the last 25 years. The former speaker just spoke also about the other forms. So definitely we're not only working on trafficking for sexual exploitation, but this has been a major focus of our work. The persons we assisted include people that were forced into prostitution, but also many people that consented to engage in sex work and still became victims of trafficking. And I want to be very clear about that, because they were deceived, the conditions of work and payment were not what they were promised to, and also there were other ways why they were severely exploited and abused. And we heard this already from many of the speakers today. And so since our establishment, we always made a very clear distinction between sexual exploitation, trafficking for sexual exploitation, and sex work, as these issues should not be conflated. And in particular, when we talk about, and when policies talk about addressing demand, we see that this conflation is often happening. We always made very clear that we as an anti-trafficking platform, we promote human rights and workers' rights. I'm very, very happy also that the speaker before me just said this, because whether persons work in a regular or irregular sector, it's quite logic, therefore, that we promote sex workers' rights and also undocumented workers' rights. And that doesn't mean that we promote sex work or any other services or labor sector, and that we are denying that severe exploitation occurs in the sex industry, because we are very much aware of that. And I think all of us are very much aware of that. So we also would like to stress that LSI wants those that are responsible for exploitation and abuse of sex workers and victims of trafficking to be prosecuted and to ensure access to their justice. So here I think we align with what many people believe in the anti-trafficking field. And even though we have a different opinion on the issue of demand. If we now look at the European context to address trafficking for sexual exploitation, and many speakers already said it, we see for long a call for demand measures and for criminalization measures and for the promotion of the Nordic model. As for current legislation, everyone probably knows the UN protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in person, and that requires states to discourage the demand that foster all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. And that's the same with the 2005 Council of Europe Convention against trafficking in human beings, and also the 2011 EU Anti-Trafficking Directive. So these legal instruments, which are currently still in place, do not make any exceptions or focus specifically on a particular sector like the sex industry. However, and then if we look at the practical situation, we see that since the issue of demand was introduced in international legislation, we see that there's no common understanding of what demand or demand measures mean. And we also see that the economic term is often a bit artificial used for the anti-trafficking field, as well that we know that demand measures taken by governments very often, mainly translate into criminalizing sex work or clients of sex workers, or the criminalization of the knowingly use of sexual services only. Generally, in the anti-trafficking field in Europe, we see for long a predominant policy focus on trafficking for sexual exploitation. So that's in general there, even though international legislation provides for a much broader focus and definition of human trafficking, and European countries have all criminalized all the different forms of human trafficking, this predominant focus on addressing sexual exploitation remains. If we look now at the current demand, and I still hope that I have sufficient time, I know that you're precious for time. If we look at the demand measures and the demand discussions in Europe, they focus in particular on criminalizing the knowingly use of services provided by victims of trafficking, which involve exploitation. And as we already heard, several European countries, including the Netherlands, have now legislation on this. In the Netherlands, it was just adopted. Whereas the EU Anti-Trafficking Directive, as well as the Council of Europe Convention, requires member states just to consider criminal sanctions, and however, this is now changing. The latest non-binding resolution of the European Parliament, which was actually adopted in February, and it was promoted by the FEM and LIBE Committee, calls on the European Commission to amend the Anti-Trafficking Directive with a view to ensure that member states explicitly criminalize the knowingly use of all services provided for by victims of trafficking which involve exploitation. And this call for stronger measures on addressing demand is now also reflected in the new EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings, which was launched on 14th of April this year. While this EU strategy, and I know that in the agenda I was asked also to reflect on this EU strategy, has some very good and concrete actions to address human trafficking, and is not only focusing, which is also very positive, on trafficking for sexual exploitation, but also forced and labor exploitation, and also reflects on certain vulnerable sectors, and also calls, for example, for binding due diligence legislation, more awareness, more information for victims and vulnerable group, and actually also calls for more support to NGOs, in particular outside Europe, and also actually has an inclusion of creating safe environments for victims to report their crime. As we can expect it, a big focus of this new EU strategy is again on demand. As part of this EU strategy, the Commission now plans to assess the possibility of establishing minimum EU rules on criminalizing the use of exploitative services of trafficking victims, and also considers a revision of the EU directive on this. Next to what we expect as a further negative impact for sex workers, and we heard already the stories from all of you, we also feel generally we doubt about the need for a revision of the EU directive. We rather, as also some speakers already said, we rather see better implementation of the directive, and we generally oppose and doubt about the feasibility and the effectiveness of binding legislation on criminalizing the knowingly use of trafficked persons' services. We feel that the international and EU legal framework already criminalizes human trafficking, also the intent and profit of exploitation. And we see actually how difficult it is to prove human trafficking and to start investigations and to get perpetrators prosecuted. Broadening the criminal liability and also criminalizing all those that knowingly use services which involve exploitation is, according to us, very dangerous, impractical, especially as was recently recommended by MEPs. The user should demonstrate that all reasonable steps were taken to avoid the use of services provided by a victim. So to conclude, instead, we call for a human rights perspective, for measures that promote empowerment and workers' rights. We feel that further assessment is urgently needed about the real impacts of demand measures and also anti-trafficking measures in general. As we heard, it's not only demand measures, but also other measures taken in the fight against human trafficking that harm sex workers and other vulnerable workers. And we feel that indeed sex workers should be included in the development of anti-trafficking policies and measures, and help with outreach and help with identification. And together with ICRSE and PICAM, we have called for more social inclusion of sex workers in debate. And to answer one of the questions, no, this is not happening yet. And we feel generally a fear, in particular among international organizations, to invite sex workers and ICRSE on the table. And I think they should not be afraid. They should give them a voice, and they should tell them what's happening in the field. I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. So we're now into Q&A a bit for a little while. If you were a panelist and you've got your camera turned off, I'm going to assume you're not there. So we've got a couple of comments in the Q&A, so I'll just touch on those. That Michelle is pointing out that clients also report trafficking, and that the intrinsic link between immigration policy and trafficking as well, which I'm sure we're all pretty aware of. We've got a question here that would be really great to clarify, because I'm sure Magnus is not the only person who's not clear on this, and sometimes people deeply embedded in it can forget this. So Magnus is asking, what's the purpose of explicitly criminalizing those knowingly using services of victims of human trafficking? What's the purpose of explicitly criminalizing those knowingly using services of victims of trafficking? Is it just to introduce harsher sentences? Is it a symbolic move? I think we're going to come to this a little bit in the next panel, but I wonder if some of our panelists would like to touch on this. Maybe, Hermine, maybe you'd like to say something. I don't want to put you on the spot. I can see you though.
I'm here. I was reading the question. Well, that's quite a difficult question. But I would say that we have to think of the feminist move, the feminist attempt to pinpoint sex work as being violence against a person. That is the point. So saying that all sex workers are victims then leads to this theory where feminist groups, and let's talk about the Swedish model, that's it. And where we want to see that sex workers are just victims and then there's no self-determination and a clear choice to do sex work or to recognize sex work as work. Okay. Now, when you talk about having clients having sex or clients buying sex from victims of trafficking, it becomes a very tangled discourse. How would you now say that a person must have a label on her head to say, I am a victim, so you don't have to buy sex from me? No, we have to consider sex work as work and then distinguish from sex work and coerced prostitution or persons who have been forced into prostitution. I think that's where we have to start from, first of all.
Thank you. Does anyone else who is on the panel want to come in on that? Susanna?
Maybe I'll be very short. I think generally the idea is that actually we do fail by prosecuting traffickers. So generally the idea is that if we establish further legislation on the knowingly use, we can also criminalize those people who profit from exploitation of others, maybe not by directly exploiting others, but because they buy the services or because they make use of exploitative labor. And however, as I said already, we think that actually anti-trafficking legislation already offers the opportunity to say if you intentionally exploit people and if you also profit from it, use anti-trafficking legislation for that. And that's our point. But that's the idea. The argument used is now that they cannot prosecute sufficiently those people who contribute to the exploitation and abuse.
Thank you. And while I wait and see if there's any final question, I've got a question for Maxime. I think the project you're describing sounds really incredible, something that could be implemented in lots of different countries. And I'm really interested to know, what do you think this has created the foundations for? Like, where do you see things going next? What are your hopes for it?
What is the next step for this project and in Europe?
For what ICRSE has been doing with the partnership with police and this kind of thing, where do you see it going next?
I think we have to consolidate already what is existing, because it's many obstacles everywhere. Like for the safe reporting project, at the beginning we thought it will be easier, also because the police officer, the local police, was really friendly. They give us, they create a WhatsApp group and some stuff like that. So we thought it will be easy. And finally, at the first complaint, it wasn't really clear. They come just to talk first, and they wanted to book another appointment to make the complaint really. So the sex workers concerned by this situation was a little bit frustrated. So that it's just a small example, but it's many things we have to consolidate. And I think the next step is, in some district, like in the North District in Brussels, and I think it's also somewhere else in Belgium or in Europe, the district specific of sex work. Many of the stakeholders can see trafficking or smuggling or situation between them, because it's not every time totally clear between prosecutor and victim. It's not so easy. And everyone can see the different situation, but we don't have a specific action plan together to fight and involve people in the society. And that is the point, I think. We have to be at the same table with the policymakers, with the police officer, with sex workers, with sex worker-led organization, and took decision together. And of course, it's complicated because we don't have the same interest and expectation, I think. But yeah, in my opinion, it's the next step for the future. We are quite positive within Utopia because we've seen the last few years many change, and it was totally unexpected. So yeah, we are positive, but we have to see how it's managing. And of course, I think it's not just related with sex work, because I think in Belgium, but everywhere in Europe, it's the same case. It's related with regulation for migrants people, if they are sex worker or not. It's every time it's the case at the end.
And some of the comments that have been coming through are very much about that. We've only got 1 minute left. So Hermine, I wonder if you can just give a really quick response to this final question that's come in, because it's an interesting question that I'm sure lots of people might have.
Yes, I was typing the answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, at least in Italy, but I think we have quite the same system like in Belgium. We have trained professionals who receive and who assist victims of trafficking. And from what victims say, so we don't project our own views to victims or to survivors of trafficking. So we listen to what they say. We listen and we pinpoint some identifications of the elements they tell us from what happened to them during their trip or their migration, their migratory process to Europe. So it is fundamental for us to understand what happened to them, how they were recruited from their country of origin, and what traffickers did to them during their journey to Europe. There are some elements, there are very particular elements that we have to identify and recognize them as victims of trafficking or as survivors of trafficking. And then when you have a woman, especially from Latin America or from Southeast Asia, who tells you, I want to do sex work, and I have to respect that. But then I have to ensure that that person, it could be a woman, it could be a transgender, it could be a man. I have to ensure that that person's rights are guaranteed as a migrant who has papers and who has access to health services. Okay, so we really differentiate that, and this is the experience we've acquired over 20 years. And when we meet women on the streets or transgenders on the streets, our approach is not a victimistic approach, but it is to respect the person as a worker on the street, and then understand on a second step if that person is in danger or not. But first of all, we have to create also kind of relationship, trust relationship, in order to put the person at ease, to tell us what has happened to him or to her. And this methodology was what we also got from the TAMPEP International Foundation, how to meet people on the street, what to talk about on the street with persons. When I say street, it's because I work in Italy and most of the people we meet are on the streets. And I am aware of the fact that in other countries you work in brothels. We don't have this access to brothels. There are no legal brothels in Italy, but we know there are areas where people are hidden and where they work. Okay, we have massage parlors, mostly by Asian women, and we don't have that easy access into them. So we have to kind of create an excuse to go into these massage parlors. In some Italian cities, this happens. In the city where I work, I meet women on the streets, but the first thing we do is not to say, oh, are you a trafficked victim? No. But we first of all respect the person as a migrant, as a person who is working. And then the other things come on.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely clear answer. And this is the end of our second panel. So I believe we might be having a short break now before the third one, but perhaps Luca will tell me what's happening.
Okay.
Yes, we do have a break now, I believe, until like a 10-minute break. So let's have a 10-minute break and then we come back for our final panel. Thanks so much, Emily, and all the speakers for this brilliant panel.
Thank you.
Listen.
All right. Can someone just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Yay. All right. If everyone's ready, I think we should get started with the third and final panel. My name is Gino Mack. I'm a sex worker activist with Swarm in the UK, the sex work advocacy and resistance movement. I'm also the author of Revolting Prostitutes, the fight for sex workers' rights, which I co-authored with Molly Smith. It came out a few years ago. I'm really excited to be here today. It's just so exciting to be having this event that brings together all these thinkers from within and around the sex worker movement, together with our comrades in the anti-trafficking arena. So super excited. This last panel is titled End Demand, the best approach to tackling exploitation in the sex industry. It's a topic I feel super passionately about. And we've got a really good lineup of speakers to talk to you about this. First up, we have Dorothea Winkler, a member of the Council of Europe Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, or GRETA. We also have Irena Fershik-Konechna doing a presentation of an ICRSE report from Vulnerability to Resilience, Sex Workers Organising to End Exploitation. We have Professor Nicola Mai from the University of Kingston in London, who is the founder of the Sexual Humanitarianism, Migration, Sex Work and Trafficking Project, or SEXHUM, as it is charmingly called. Thierry Schaffauser, activist from the French Union of Sex Workers, or Strass, in France. We have Emily Kenway, who we've already heard from today, who was chairing the earlier panel, who is a writer, activist, and former policy advisor, and author of the amazing book, The Truth About Modern Slavery. And Sabrina Sanchez from Ortiz and in Spain, also with ICRSE. Super excited to hear from all of you. Just a housekeeping note, again, if you're speaking, try to keep it to 7 minutes. I will send you a friendly nudge when you've gone over that mark. And please do drop comments and questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them if we have time. And thank you, enjoy the panel. Dorothea, do you want to take us away?
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today to have some 7 minutes together with you. I will stay for another hour. I hope we have some fruitful discussions. I'm Doro Winkler. I'm working since 23 years in the fight against trafficking. I'm working in FITS, which is an organization in Switzerland, working in the protection of victims of trafficking, and we are also working with sex workers. We have a counseling center for sex workers. But now here today, I'm in my role as a GRETA member of GRETA, Group of Experts on Trafficking from the Council of Europe. And I wanted to share with you some thoughts about how you, sex worker organizations and sex workers, individuals, can share your experiences with us, with GRETA, during our country events. And I'm very happy to see Thierry, which we met in our last country visit in France. Just as a good example, maybe we can come back to that. Well, the basic of our work is the Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings from the Council of Europe, which is signed by 47 states, and it's like a binding treaty, a binding agreement for the states. The convention wants states to ensure the protection of human rights of trafficked persons, the prevention and the prosecution of those responsible for it. So a treaty alone is not very helpful if you can't look at the countries to see if they are fulfilling it. That's why the Council of Europe established a monitoring mechanism, and this is GRETA, which was founded before Greta Thunberg, so before the climate change movement. But nevertheless, we are called GRETA, as already mentioned, Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings. We are an independent group, independent experts from different states. I'm from Switzerland, others from other states. We have very mixed experiences from NGOs, from prosecutors, police, women, from the science. So we are a very differentiated group. Well, for the Council of Europe, for the convention, the role of civil society is very, very important. Civil society plays an important role in the implementation of the convention. Greta is very aware about the broad knowledge of civil society organizations with their work in awareness raising, research, training, detecting victims of trafficking, providing them with accommodation and assistance, and supporting them through the criminal justice process. This is why the input of civil society in the evaluation process is very, very crucial for us. And also the convention itself in paragraph 35 says that all parties, so the states, shall encourage state authorities and public officials to cooperate with non-governmental organizations. And let me say something very personal. In this more than 20 years I'm working in the fight against trafficking, I think that was the most important experience I did was that the cooperation of all the involved actors is the crucial key to fight trafficking. If you are not cooperating with each other, we have no chance to fight trafficking. So I'm very happy that also the convention itself mentions it as an important point. So now let me say something about when we go to country evaluations, how the process is and how you can be involved as NGOs. Before we go on a country visit, we receive a report from the government. This report is based on a questionnaire we formulate. Now we are in the third round of the third evaluation round, which is about access to justice. And therefore, we write a questionnaire and the states are responding on it. This response from the state is official, so it's published, so you can have a look at it. But always Greta also seeks information directly from civil society, which is very important for us. NGOs can provide information by answering the questionnaire themselves. So you can send to the Secretariat your answers to the questions we ask the governments, because you surely will have other experiences than the governments. And you can also decide to do a joint report. Often we have like networks, national networks who do a joint report, a shadow report or an alternative report, which is also very helpful for us to understand the situation in the country. You can imagine, I know that from Switzerland, that the states are trying to show that everything is very good. What they do, they try their best, which I can agree, they try. But you as NGOs, you know that there are some lacks, that there are some difficulties, and this is very helpful for the Greta members to know where you find the problems. This helps us also to discuss it later with the government responsibles. So before we come, we have these reports. So we have to read a lot, and then we do a country visit, which is not visit to the country that we want to evaluate, which is normally 1 week. And the first day of this country visit, we meet NGOs. We meet NGOs, specialized NGOs for trafficking, trade unions, research institutes, human rights NGOs, or sex workers organizations. This is very important for us because like this, we see the experiences we learn about the experiences on the ground. So the first day is the NGO day. Then the other days, 3 to 4 to 5, we meet with all the government institutions you can imagine to see how they apply the Convention Against Trafficking. And it's very helpful for us to have the NGO experience beforehand. In the country visits I participated, as I mentioned, for example, in France, we met representatives of sex workers, and it was very helpful to understand the situation in the country. Greta is very grateful to the contributions by the NGOs and is committed to continue the cooperation with the civil society. So just let me come to the point. You as an NGO can help Greta to understand the situation in your country by give us information before our country visits, during the country visits, and write us also letters after the country visits when you see that something is going wrong, when you have concerns about the situation. We always discuss these letters in our meetings. We have 3 times a year in Strasbourg normally when there is no corona. And we decide if we want to react with an official letter or whatever is asked or whatever makes sense. You can also give us examples on the impact of legislation, policy or measures aimed at reducing demand, for example, legislation that is stigmatizing sex workers, or, which can have a negative effect also on the trafficking victims. And you can also report us some good examples that if you see some best practices, if you see it in your countries. That helps us very much to understand the situation in the country and to make a better report at the end to show the countries where they can improve. I hope the 7 minutes are fine. Juno?
Yeah, that's pretty much amazing. Well done. Thank you so much for those insights. I'm sure that people in the audience will have some interesting questions for you. For now, we're going to move on to Irena. Are you there, Irena?
Yes, I'm here. I will just share the screen now. Okay, so I will start with the presentation. As it was said, we worked for more than 2 years on Rights Not Rescue project that was about strengthening the capacities of our members and the Secretariat in addressing complex issues of human trafficking, exploitation, and migration and sex work. This project was mainly realized by subgranting 12 ICRSE members in 10 European countries in order to develop new or support existing strategies addressing exploitation, and as well as to promote sex workers' inclusive anti-trafficking response at the international levels. I will here highlight just few issues that you will find in the report. We try to elaborate on how sex workers do understand exploitation, and exploitation is understood to include unjust labor relations between sex workers and those who in some way facilitate and profit from their work. And sex workers hardly ever define their relationship with their clients as exploitative. And only by focusing on sex workers' working conditions as well as employment practices, we can come to better understanding of what constitutes exploitation in the sex industry. And moreover, what I would like to add that according to sex workers, one of the key reasons for their victimization is the lack of safe working places that is exacerbated by criminalization of sex work industry. Also, we try to elaborate more about the end demand. And as it was already said, very often end demand strategies are implemented only in a way of criminalizing of clients of sex workers. And this strategy this approach exacerbates the vulnerabilities of sex workers to violence, exploitation, and human trafficking, rather than eliminating the end demand that fosters exploitation. And I would like to highlight here that when we are speaking about demand, we are speaking about demand in the context of demand for that fosters exploitation. We don't speak about demand for certain services or certain sector. And these laws are disproportionately enforced in the spaces occupied by sex workers, their homes, neighborhoods, working establishments, and other workplaces. And as a result, sex workers, not the client, not the third parties, incur the majority of profiling, surveillance, and policing under these measures, and not only while working, but unfortunately also in their day-to-day lives. And instead, we should call for a human rights perspective that should prioritize measures to address demand for cheap, underpaid, or even unpaid work and services, and demand for unprotected labor. And for instance, we can look at how the end demand policies are implemented, for instance, in New Zealand. that decriminalized all sex work, and we can see that and demand measures and policies, for instance, explicitly prohibit pressuring a sex worker to provide services. So this is something what we can learn from and what we do not have here in the European context, and this is the context of decriminalization. Also, the report very much looks at how sex workers communities tackle exploitation and trafficking. And we know that in the research in anti-trafficking, there has been lots of attention placed on the vulnerability of people at risk of trafficking, and less attention has been paid to resilience of individuals, communities to protect themselves from abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. And resilience must be recognized and integrated in any policy developments with a focus on the empowerment of vulnerable communities. And vulnerabilities of population prone to exploitation and human trafficking can be addressed by tapping into their resilience through empowering their communities and community-based organizations. And as we have already heard from Bobby and from speakers, sex workers globally organize and develop structures to protect themselves from violent clients, but also they organize and play a vital role in preventing children from entering into the sex trade and supporting women who have been trafficked or in a situation that is exploitative or violent situation. And the self-regulation model has been also recognized by sex worker communities globally as a progressive model for the protection of their rights. And we can also see that agencies like World Health Organization and UN agencies like UNAIDS, UNFPA, and UNDP call for meaningful inclusion of sex workers in the response of HIV, but also including in the response of violence and prevention of violence. And this is in big contrast what we can see in the policies that do address trafficking in human beings. There is no such a call to include sex workers into issues related to addressing exploitation and trafficking in their industry. It's a significant difference, and we would like to translate the calls that are already made by the UN agencies addressing HIV/AIDS into the policy developments that are focused on anti-trafficking policies and measures. And that's why we want to call for the agencies to see sex workers as agents of change and not only agency-less prostituted women in need of rescue and rehabilitation. And we as an organization call for sex worker inclusive anti-trafficking policies where the role of sex workers collective in responding violence and exploitation is recognized, and sex workers communities are involved in anti-trafficking and anti-violence programs. And we have already had many from our members. You can read in the report the concrete measures that our members took, from building collective power, such as self-organization, unionization, through the creation of safe spaces, peer support, and also conducting community research, and finally to advocacy and campaigning for law reforms. Finally, the publication includes key recommendations. I will just very briefly highlight that the key and underlying recommendation is to include sex workers in the policy development. With regard to European Commission, we've had some very tangible, let's say, hope, because as Susanna mentioned, European Commission published recently a new strategy on combating trafficking in human beings in the European Union, and the Commission calls on member states to enable funding for community-led and peer mentoring empowerment programs. So we hope that finally sex workers could be had at the European Commission's level and call their meaningful inclusion. This is where I would like to stop. You can read the report on our websites, and thank you very much for your attention.
Irena, thank you so much for that. That was a really nice slideshow, and yeah, some really amazing stuff on there. It's so wonderful to be hearing these discussions about resilience and not just victimization. It's a much needed discussion. We're going to move on next to Nick Mai, whose face I can see shining out at me. Are you ready to go, Nick? But don't forget to unmute yourself first.
Yes, I am. Thanks.
Take it away.
I'm very excited and proud to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've learned a lot from the previous interventions. It's a big challenge to try and summarize the findings of a project which took place over 4 years in 7 minutes, but I will try. I've been working on the intersection between migration and the sex industry for about 20 years and counting. And so this is the basis of what I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to now, speaking of sharing, share the a quick PowerPoint. So here it is. Yes. Right. So the Sexum project is an acronym for the concept of sexual humanitarianism, which refers to the increasing way in which some migrant groups and individuals are understood and targeted by humanitarian concerns, policies, and interventions as uniquely and specifically vulnerable in relation to their sexual behavior, which often legitimizes harmful anti-sex work and anti-immigration initiatives. A clear example that we've been discussing since this morning is the way in which anti-trafficking initiatives are used to deport migrants and to legitimize anti-sex work controls in the name of rescue and in the name of support. So this is what is at the basis of the project. We studied the relationship between migration, sex work, and trafficking in strategic sex work and migration sites in the global north, including Australia, France, New Zealand, and the US. What the project does differently from others is that it draws on migrant sex workers' own understanding and agency of exploitations rather than other people's through a coherent, innovative, and collaborative methodology. Australia, France, New Zealand, and the US were chosen because they together include all the main policymaking framework concerning sex work, from criminalization to decriminalization via legalization in the state of Victoria. So we try to adopt an innovative art science approach, combining more classical methods like long-term ethnographic observation with qualitative interviewing and participative ethnographic filmmaking. I mean, I will point you to the website for more information about particularly the last method. Of course, it was a collective effort. So the research team of the project, of which I was only the PI, was made of, includes PG Machotti in Australia, Kalogero Jametta in France, Callum Beneke in New Zealand, and 3 people in the US, Annie Ferenbacher, Jennifer Masto, and Heidi Hofinger, who split the double field work between New York and LA. So we try to achieve a very diverse sample in terms of ethnicity, area of work, migration, sex, gender identity, class, and race. We purposely included racialized and sex-gendered minorities as research participants because they are particularly targeted by repressive sexual humanitarian interventions and wider dynamics of social exclusion, marginalization, and criminalization. I'm going to focus now on France because the panel is about the end demand situation, and France is the country of the project in which this approach has been introduced right in the year of its beginning, because the project went from 2016 to 2020. So France, as we all know, adopted an abolitionist law against the prostitutional system, which is the way they call sex work, in April 2016. It's based, as we know, on the criminalization of clients and decriminalization of soliciting. However, there's been a huge increase in municipal restriction orders, but also the offer of exiting programs, which were supposed to support victims of trafficking and people who left the sex industry, was insufficient. That actually ended up by marginalizing the very people they were supposed to support. It was a chronicle of a disaster foretold. I was the PI of another project between 2014 and 2015, before the law was even introduced, which already anticipated the findings of the project, because people, every time there were big debates on the media, clients behaved as if the law was in place. And so people already knew what was going to happen. And what we found out, unfortunately, was that the so-called law against the prostitutional system led to the further precariousness of sex workers who had to spend more time and do more clients for less money. Most importantly, they have to do clients they didn't want to do and which they would have refused earlier. And there was a marked increase in violence and abuse from criminals and clients who paradoxically have more power in a criminalized context, because they are a scarce resource and therefore they can dictate the conditions. So this is a very perverse actually outcome of the law, which was supposed to do actually the opposite. Dramatically, some groups had to interrupt HIV and AIDS treatment because they had to work in different cities from the ones they were receiving treatments, and so there's been a resurgence of HIV and AIDS in relatively to a small population, in a country like France, where there is quite a good provision of these services. We collaborated with the Doctors of the World in undertaking a community-based research. So I'm not going to labor on these findings because they are known, but just a few numbers. 63% of sex workers experience deterioration of their living conditions, more isolation and greater stress, and many others experience a lot of income. We have particularly been working with the Chinese community and the trans-Latino community, who experienced losses. There were murders actually in the context of the climate that was produced by the law. So this law is very harmful. I'm going to now move on to the overall findings of the project. One thing I would like to say is that New Zealand keeps being brought up as an example for decriminalization. It is not an example to follow when it comes down to migrant sex workers, because migrant sex workers in New Zealand are not covered by decriminalization, and they are exploited or exploitable because of that. There is an article that we're going to publish hopefully in the next few days, which will cover these details. So the best case example for policymaking that we found was the New South Wales state of Australia, where migrant sex workers where migrants with a temporary visa can also work legally in the sex industry, which means that they don't have to use the services of brokers and traffickers. Okay, overall findings very quickly. June, how am I doing with time?
You're about on time, but if you're close to wrapping up, then take a little longer.
Okay, thank you. So most of our research participants understood their experience of exploitation as labor exploitation in relation to working condition rather than sexual exploitation. For many, working in the sex industry was a way to avoid being exploited in either forms of labor which were available to them. So this kind of turns on its head the stereotype about sex worker being more exploitative than other works. Across all the four settings of the project, humanitarian concerns and intervention are a framework that legitimizes repressive and racialized forms of migration control, this including in Australia, and this I will cover later, and also particularly racialized populations such as Asian cis women and trans Latina women, but also in America, African American cis women are in the eye of the storm, and they tend to be singled out as potentially more exploitable and therefore more deportable. Also, and very importantly, the agency of the people we talked about was rooted in their collective, not only individual experiences, which is very important because if we want to support sex workers, we need to support the organizations that support them, not only politically, but with money. And this is very important because in all of the four states and realities, we explored, peer organizations were not only a symbolic way of support. They actually carried out vital anti-trafficking and also economic supports, particularly in the COVID-19 situations where most migrant sex workers were excluded and therefore relied on peer schemes through which they actually could have food. Policy making, very quickly. There is an inversely proportional relation between the degree of criminalization of sex work and the ability of migrant and non-migrant sex workers to assert their rights and live their lives. So if we go from Australia, then New Zealand, then France, then the US. The US, obviously, because of criminalization, was the most severe case study. It was the most negative case study. I don't have time to do that. One takeaway point from our findings in terms of policy making, and I'm very glad that people from Greta are here, Dorothea is here, is that anti-trafficking policies and intervention need to be clearly and visibly separated from migration control if they want to be supportive and not repressive of migrant sex workers. If you do a rescue raid in a brothel in Soho, why do you bring the UK border force if it's about supporting people? They shouldn't be there. If you bring the border force, it is an anti-immigration control disguised as an anti-trafficking operation. And migrant sex workers know it, and they keep away from the police, even when they are in danger of being exploited. So the decriminalization of all forms of sex work is a fundamental starting point to counter the economic vulnerability and the violence and abuse associated with sex work. But it's only a starting point because, as racialized people told us over and over again, decriing can be perceived as a white people's luxury, because there are very entrenched ways in which racialization and transphobia, for example, corner people outside of even these mechanisms of protection. So it needs to be combined with mainstream anti-discriminatory law that support people in relation to housing, at work, and integration according to their minority points. I'm sorry if I went a bit too long, but it was a very big project and I just wanted to make sure I just put it all out there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Nick. Everything that you've said since the 7-minute mark, I was like, yes. I just wanted to hear all of it. So
I'm glad
you got away with that. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it was great. Thank you so much for that. There's stuff I want to say, but we're going to just move on and we can come back to discussion in a bit. Thierry, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am ready.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm a sex worker from France and a member of Strass, which is the France Sex Workers Trade Union. We have a bit more than 500 members, sex workers members, and also about 3,000 sex workers who follow us on social media. So as you know, France is the country where is implemented the end demand model, the criminalization of clients and third parties. And I have about 6 points to explain why this doesn't work. The first is that there's no success according to police figures. So we have the reports from the police authorities that show that indeed there's an increase in the number of victims of trafficking identified, and a very big increase in the number of children, people under 18 who also are exploited. Of course, the prohibitionists will say that it's a success of the law because it means the law has helped the police to identify more victims. I don't agree with this analysis because there's no increase in the means given to the police to do their work. And also because the police authorities tend to complain actually about the law. Not so much about the client's criminalization part, because even if they say that it doesn't help them to provide any information, because often the clients, when they are arrested, they can't give information about potential exploiters, but also because they complain about the decriminalization of soliciting, which actually we support, obviously, but the police are not happy with that. So the fact that the police complain about the law also, I think it shows that the increase in the numbers actually show an increase in the phenomenon. And even the prohibitionists actually, they use that when it comes to the children exploitation to say that there's a problem. So some often contradict themselves about whether there's an increase or not. And actually, there's no proof, there's no evidence that trafficking has decreased since the implementation of the criminalization of clients. And I think everyone agrees with that. The second point is the problem we have with the conflation of the concept of procurement or pimping, well, the laws against the all organizing of sex work, and the concept of trafficking. So this is also outlined by the Greta report on France. I think it's a problem because we don't have a good understanding of what's going on, because the procurement laws actually, they target all sex workers. And there's no need, the definition in the French law is so large, but there's no need to any force or any constraint to prove the pimping or procurement happening. And it is the reason why the justice and the police most often use the cases of procurement instead of trafficking. And then they end up with figures conflating everything. But the problem is that it's not just because you rent a flat and that the landlord is considered as a pimp, but you are a real victim of trafficking. But they use that or misuse that to present or to misrepresent the whole sex industry. And I think it shows also that we are actually not fighting against trafficking, but we are actually fighting against the existence of sex work. The third point is about the coronavirus crisis that showed also the failure of the approach, because the main argument behind the end demand is to say the client's demand for sex is the main reasons for human trafficking to occur. We saw during the lockdowns that everyone had to stop working because of the health restrictions. And so there was no demand for sex. There was no sex work happening, but the trafficking didn't disappear and sex workers didn't disappear. So when they say, no demand, no prostitution, no trafficking, we experience that and it doesn't work. It's not how it operates in reality. And I could add also about the government responses to the crisis, or the lack of responses, is also motivated by arguments about trafficking, because there was a fear that giving money to sex workers would only make sex workers giving the money to their pimps, because they think we all have pimps or that we are manipulated. So it was also a way to refuse helping people in the time of the crisis. And I think the victims of trafficking were probably among the people who suffered the most during the coronavirus crisis lockdowns. I think also another consequence of client criminalization is that the clients themselves, they stop reporting any cases of trafficking, because often a client who fall in love to a sex worker, they tend to want to help and rescue someone who's identified as a victim. And of course, this is more difficult to happen when the clients are criminalized. But also we see that when clients are criminalized, it's more difficult to, or even impossible to talk to them directly on the street. So we have a very good example, especially with the Chinese community, Chinese sex workers who don't speak French nor English. And they need time to talk to the client with maybe some gesture or try to make themselves understand, to negotiate. This is no longer possible when there's a police car in the neighborhood and they are looking at them and they are arresting the clients, and you can't work anymore. So what happened is that they now rely on third parties who can answer the phone, who can write the adverts, and they actually even have to pay them now. So this is a proof that there was an increase in the exploitation, or at least the fact to rely on third parties. And of course, this is more susceptible, likely to be victims of forced labor when you rely more on third parties. There's an argument also on internet, the fact that now there's all trafficking happening on the internet, but I think the ban on advertising in France also showed that it led to less people being identified. So we have a clear example with the Viva Street website that was closed down after a complaint from the prohibitionist organization. And even the police, they tended to complain about that, because they said, we used to have a collaboration from this French website, and they helped us to identify the victims. Now people either have to go to foreign-based websites, but don't collaborate with the French police because there's no language, there's a language barrier, there's no legal obligation and all that on different laws. And also the fact that now the people, and especially for the minors, people under 18, they go to social media to use different platforms where they are invisible, which is very, very brief encounters. It's very easy, to remain invisible. So even the police, they tend to complain about that because it's more difficult to identify any situation of abuse. I think another problem is the general suspicion on sex workers. And a good example is what the prohibition is called the effet Zaya effect. Zaya was a teenager who had sex with footballers, famous footballers. So there was a big scandal in France because She was selling sex to this famous man, and she's now accused to promote sex work because she never identified as a victim, even if she was under 18. And she said she was a courtesan, and she was like maybe not proud, but actually choosing what she was doing. And now we say that it's because of the sex workers talking about sex work, saying they're not victims, but we glamorize prostitution, that we encourage young people to fall in prostitution. So instead of understanding exploitation and violence and all the problems existing in the sex industry as something structural due to the criminalization actually of different structural oppressions, we target the sex workers, and Thierry is a good example, as the ones who are responsible for what we suffer. The idea that we are in love, we have our pimps, that we're manipulating, all that is very strong. And it's the reason also why the sex worker organizations are never trusted or included in the conversation around trafficking. And indeed, we don't have any funding to fight trafficking. We have no resources. So we have to rely really on our own resources if you want to help colleagues who are victims. Then I want to talk about identification. There's a problem to identify sex workers and to protect them after the identification, because everything has to go through the police. There is no independent mechanism to officially identify victims of trafficking. There's two ways in France. You have either the labor inspection du travail, so the labor inspection, but obviously sex workers are denied that process because we're not recognized as workers. Sex work is not recognized as work. So the only way for victims of trafficking in the sex industry to be identified is to go to the police, and increasingly they demand to report a crime of trafficking, which is often not that easy to do because many people are afraid of repercussion to their family, to people in their country and all that, but also because there's no sufficient guarantee of protection. And I think it's really what's failing the most in France in the fight against trafficking, is that we have many laws to repress everything, even migration and clients. And I think it goes too far because it's counterproductive. But what we lack the most, I think, is the protection in terms of housing and residency status for undocumented migrants. Because of course, the police is the people they're the most afraid of, and they are told that it's through the police that they may be informed about their rights and have access to support and all that. When in reality, we see it's more complicated. We have about 200 people maybe who manage to have access to residency permits for asylum or different immigration laws, but the majority of people actually struggle a lot to access that. And actually, most of the victims we know that don't go through, just actually manage to free themselves by themselves with the support of the sex worker community or maybe a client. So we see it doesn't really work properly. I will end with the solutions. I think sex workers are part of the solution in the fight against trafficking. About the independent mechanism, I think what we demand actually is that it includes also the NGOs and the organizations that provide services to migrant sex workers and victims of trafficking. So of course, it should include also sex worker-led organizations, because we are really close to the people who are subjected to this violence and exploitation. Other solutions I would recommend are three. First thing is labor rights and social protection, because I think there's no difference between trafficking in the sex industry and in other industries. I think the main reason we have a problem of forced labor is because of the lack of labor rights and social protection. And often we notice that it's undocumented migrants who are the most targeted by traffickers. And in the sex industry, it's the same. It's the lack of documentation and the lack of labor rights add also a vulnerability to the fact to be trapped or exposed or by people who will abuse your situation. Of course, this can happen only through decriminalization of sex work, because as long as sex work is criminalized, we can see it's the main obstacle to have labor rights recognized And we saw that also during the coronavirus crisis, where many sex workers couldn't access to the indemnities due to the lockdowns. The second point, the second demand is really the regularization of undocumented migrants, because otherwise people will be forced to remain in the informal economy. And we saw that with a lack of paper, you can't register even as a self-employed sex worker or some mechanism that already exists. I would add a third point, which is about changing the framework and the understanding around trafficking by stop talking about sexual exploitation. And I would rather use the phrase of human trafficking for the purpose of forced labor in the sex industry, because it's making a difference between forced labor and sexual exploitation. It means that sex work in itself as something so different that the reason of trafficking is sex work, when the reason of trafficking is not sex work, is not sex. The problem is not sex, the problem is about labor. And when sex worker, we always talk about work, and people always hear us talking about sex. And I think it's really one of the problems here. And we saw clearly that the way this conflation happens is very prejudicial and detrimental to all sex workers, including the victims of trafficking, because it makes it even very more complicated to identify the victims, to access rights and justice. And I think the main solution to me is clearly about decriminalization and labor rights. So I will end with that, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thierry. I think it's so important for everybody who's attending and everyone interested in this to really hear from sex workers about the actual texture and the everyday reality of how people sell sex under these conditions, and how these policies and conditions like the pandemic can really exacerbate things. My understanding of exploitation in the sex industry has deepened so much since the pandemic. Just hearing every day on the phone with people who applied to the Swarm Mutual Aid Fund, explaining over and over again how having no money is changing the conditions under which they're working, is changing their relationship to third actors like managers, in the need to find clients in the context where the advertising platforms aren't allowing anyone to list their phone numbers. And this is just within the pandemic, let alone within the context of the last 20 years in Europe. So thank you so much for taking the time to outline the realities here. We're now going to move on to Emily Kenway, who I'm very excited to hear from. I have her book right here. Are you ready to go, Emily?
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much, Juno. So yeah, I'm going to speak as someone who has been a policy advisor on human trafficking to, for example, the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner and various other organisations. And in answering the question of whether end demand is the best approach, I think there's two ways to consider that question. One of which is to look at the actual evidence from the countries where it exists. And the other is to consider the underpinning logic of this as an approach versus what we know about trafficking and how trafficking operates in general. And I'm going to focus on the second one because I think a lot of us know the evidence, and I do go into it in my book. So if we're thinking about the underpinning logic, so we know that trafficking happens in sectors where the product or service is legal to buy. So cleaning, tomato farming, construction, domestic work, all legal to buy those things. Also where it's illegal. So cannabis cultivation. In the UK, we have something called county lines, which is a form of drug dealing that involves human trafficking. It's illegal to buy those things, MDMA, cocaine, whatever it is. And then we have things that are somewhere in between. So in the UK, sex work ostensibly falls into somewhere in between legal and illegal. But trafficking happens in all of these spaces. So clearly the commonality can't be whether or not the product or service is legal to purchase per se. Rather, if we understand how trafficking actually operates, drawing on it across all sectors where it is present, then we can see that the commonality there is that it happens in sectors where there's a very high preponderance of people who have limited rights, who have limited alternative options, and who have reasons to fear going to the authorities or to feel hostile towards them. So this means populations of people who have vulnerabilities constructed by the economic circumstance they're in, by the immigration policy regime they're in. So that might mean, for example, irregular immigration status. It might mean poverty and the only work being available being hugely precarious and in an informal sector. It might mean debt that you're desperately trying to pay back. So it's people with exploitable vulnerabilities, exploitable dependencies, as one political philosopher puts it, that you find trafficking. It's not about whether something is legal or illegal to buy. But this fact is uncomfortable from a political perspective, right? Because it means if we want to tackle trafficking, then a law that simply makes it illegal to buy a service isn't going to cut it. We'd need to look at people's rights. We'd need to look at people's livelihood options. We'd need to look at the role of the state. So what we see with anti-trafficking narratives and action, and in the UK, modern slavery narratives and action, is sidestepping that political discomfort by focusing on the idea of the bad apple, right? That the problem isn't these underlying conditions that, you know, oh gosh, we don't want to have to think about those. The problem is individual deviants, right? That we can chase down, pop in jail, save the ignorant victims who didn't understand what was going to happen to them, and everything will be fine and dandy again. And this is what we see as a narrative in mainstream labour sectors. So in supply chains of big companies, for example, in cleaning and so on, you see auditing firms offering special anti-slavery audits to come along and identify that individual bad apple whilst allowing the system to continue as usual. Within the sex industry, from an anti-trafficking perspective, the same narrative exists, except that instead of identifying only bad instances within a sector, the entire sector is described, is observed as a kind of bad apple, is considered a kind of contaminant. So the trafficking rhetoric targets the whole sector as something immoral and inherently problematic. So then we're presented with these solutions that purport to tackle trafficking, right? But they're actually tackling the sector as a whole rather than the harms within it. So the Nordic model and demand is obviously one of those. So is foster sester, so are raids on workplaces. We don't see that as a tactic in any other sector where trafficking is common, that raid approach. And that's because it's seeking to sidestep consistently the real issue to avoid the facts of those exploitable vulnerabilities, those causal factors. Instead, trying to be, you know, the first civilization ever that gets rid of purchase of sexual services. When we recognize that it's these causal factors that cause trafficking, when we recognize that most trafficking does not occur because of kidnapping and abduction, but because of rationally made choices about livelihood and migration options within constraints of an economic and immigration policy, we start to understand why decriminalization of sex work and why worker-led solutions might be so vital. Because both decrim and sex worker-led organizations can help to address those causal factors. They protect and enhance people's rights, people's options, and like we heard earlier from Maxime, can start to bridge the hostility between state and the sex industry. And there, I've had the pleasure of reading the report that's being launched, and there are so many brilliant examples in there of how this can actually work practically. Obviously, it doesn't work overnight. It's not perfect. And I think this is the real core problem with this whole issue, is that the end demand model sounds really simple. It's like an overnight solution, look, done and dusted, but it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of that fundamental misunderstanding of the problem of how trafficking actually operates. So to conclude, I think that this is why this report's really important, why this work, this project is so important. You know, someone asked earlier on one of the panels, how many victims of trafficking have sex worker organizations identified? And the answer that was given was that there are some really amazing examples, Bobby was giving one, but that there's no systematic data. And it's true, there's this dearth of examples of case studies of data that demonstrates how sex worker organizations are part of the solution. But we mustn't think that that's chance. That's not chance that it doesn't exist. It's a long-standing systemic exclusion of sex worker organizations from policy spaces, from anti-trafficking, and the colonization of anti-trafficking by people who really just want to be the first civilization ever to get rid of the sale of sexual services and fail to respect the knowledge and experience of people actually in the sex industry. So for me, end demand is not an option. Evidentially, it's not an option on terms of logic. And really, it's a choice between a fairy tale policy that doesn't work and a harder route that may actually create sustainable change, which is about decriminalization and partnership working with sex worker organizations.
Wow. Thank you, Emily. You were exactly 7 minutes, basically to the second. It's always such a pleasure to hear you talk, and such a good point about the political capital of abolition of prostitution that I think is so symbolic and powerful for people, that it occludes listening to people with experience. So thank you for that. And then lastly, we're going to hear from Sabrina. Are you ready to go, Sabrina?
I am, Juno. Thank you very much.
Take it away.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Although it's quite my responsibility also to be here, because I'm also one of the new program officers of ICRSE. I'm also a trans woman myself. I'm coming from Mexico. I've been living in Europe for the last 15 years. The same amount of years I've been being an active sex worker. I'm still am. And I'm also co-founder of Otras, that is the first sex worker-led trade union in Spain that was created on 2018. And immediately we were taken to court. That it's to the court that it's the successor of the Franquist court, the Court of Public Order, Audiencia de Orden, Tribunal de Orden Público in Spanish. So we can kind of understand how the rulings are made and how the outcomes of those rulings are. Of course, in this has been a topic, so I will give you a little bit of background for the ones that maybe you've heard a little bit of Otras, because well, it's a really something historic that in a country like in Spain, a group of sex workers with different backgrounds, with different origins, with different works in the different sectors of sex work, have come together and got the idea to make a trade union by themselves and not following the traditional labor unions that have never helped us, or the debate is like there, or they don't want to touch the debate because they don't want to break the basis, like in the feminist movement sometimes or always. So given that we're still working, we are still on the law side, on the legal side of Otras, we are still working, we are still waiting, for the decision of the Supreme Court, because the decision of the national audience was to take down our statutes for one article. Instead of taking down that one article, they decided to take away all the statutes. Of course, we appealed that, so the decision is not firm. Even so, the trade union is still legal and working, even though the media always says that you legalize trade union Otras. It's not true. We are still working, and we are so much working that during the pandemic, during 2020, this has been a very hard year for all of us. I know you have already listened to the great activists that were here, and about all what has happened in the pandemic. As you know, in Spain, we had one of the toughest lockdowns. So we were starting to have problems with the sex workers that work and live in the brothels. In Spain, just a quick reference, the most visible sex work is in the clubs de carretera, in the road clubs that are between the cities, basically like there's no population around, like industrial complexes there. So these big brothels. We have also the example in the French border in La Jonquera with they say it's the Europe's biggest brothel, the Paradise. That this, for example, the Paradise, they shut down when the order was mandated. They shut down, even though they had 90 sex workers living and working there. They didn't allow them to stay, not even by paying the part of the daily fee. Something that we could that we were able to do as a union alongside with other affiliates. We were able to support them to negotiate that they could stay in the brothel, because brothels in Spain have a hotel license given by the municipalities, but there's no sex work there. We will go to that because there's a sentence about that for one of our colleagues. So, well, given the pandemic, we were able to gather food. We organized crowdfunding, that we were able to gather 35,000 euros for 350 sex workers in the whole Spanish kingdom. And of course, we continue working and organizing ourselves. We talked in Barcelona and Madrid, being more successful in Barcelona because of the kind of government that city has, that we were able to articulate with the municipality, also the delivery of prepaid supermarket cards, so they can buy in the supermarkets. They were benefited. We reached around 60 sex workers only by Otras and Aprosex, and only in Barcelona. That was the area, the Barcelona city area, and each sex worker was able to get a card for 600 euros. So it's for about like 3 months of foods and deliveries. So we really worked on that on the ground. The abolitionist and prohibitionist organizations that get the loads of funding and millions from the state, they were answering the phone and telling us to go to the church and get food, and like while the big lockdown. We also, during the lockdown, we also organized a delivery of food. So we delivered with a card to sex workers because of also the repression from the police. They were getting stopped. They were getting mostly our trans sex worker, trans Latina sex workers colleagues that were being harassed even more. The transphobia from police like rise and transphobia and racism and everything. So that's the work that we had in the pandemic, that we could have been avoid like a lot of things if the sex workers that are working for a third party, will have the basic rights, would count as workers, would count would have the social security like in any other economic sector. If we had that because abolitionists or the mainstream media, they say that in the brothels we are working around 50,000 sex workers. We don't really know. Of course, there are no official data, but that's the calculation. And of course, will be around like 50,000 less people that we had to take care of not having any protection. They will have pay their taxes, or they will have the social protection that every worker in the industry has. And of course, this denial of recognizing ourselves as workers by the institutions led us to this, and led us to what you've been listening about and talking about deciding policies that are based that are focused in tackling migration and controlling the movement of women in all the diversity. I also include, of course, trans women. And also in this fairy tale policies that Emily just mentioned fantastically, this image that the white pureness, that the pureness of women, that not women in her by her own will be will be willing to sell sex to many, because that's really the issue. The issue on sex, that's the problem. If you read even the recommendations from the CEDAW, the last recommendation of this 2020 on chapter 4, that's the root causes for trafficking, and paragraph C, letter C, that it's the demand, and paragraphs 30 and 31, they have the distinction of sexual exploitation and the context of labor as a form of trafficking. So by not recognizing sex work as the context of labor as a form of trafficking, that they are giving the license to first of all not listening to sex workers, because of course we victims do not know what they're doing, because no one in their own sanity can sell sex by their own selves, because that for a white privileged middle class woman, it's impossible to figure out. So, and of course, we as they are children, because one of the great narratives of mainstream feminism is say okay, but if there's child labor, we're not going to make a union of children workers. We're going to abolish that. So that narrative is comparing sex workers, women in general, women that sell sex with children. So I see quite feminist, really, if you as a feminist consider another woman as a child, because the decision that woman doesn't like you, maybe you have to think about your feminism. And just to wrap up, I think I'm running out of time. Of course, that we need to be listened. We in Spain, we have the danger of not one but two laws that criminalize sex workers. One, it's included in the Ley de Libertad Sexual, in the sexual liberty law. That, well, it's also puts another legal terms to sexual abuse, etc. And in that law, they want to put the consent thing. That law want to criminalize the third parties, but the places where we do sex work. That can be the big brothels from the apartments where we usually live. So obviously the law is really it's still a draft. Both laws are still a draft. So, but there are things that are coming. So be aware on Spain, because we are going to have this year this drafts being debated and being in the public scene. So we are kind of scared because of the narrative that we are listening, and the lack of listening also to sex workers. We have been asked to meet with the Ministry of Equality. None. We have received none for answer, or quiet, or silence, and it's very unheartening that the government, that the most progressive government in the story of Spain, that's how they call themselves, denies to sit down and listen to their represented ones, because some of us voted for them in the first place. Now that there are 10 years of the outrage, the Indignados movement, that some of them got the institutions, and some of us are still fighting for the same things that we were fighting 10 years ago, with them on the streets. But now that they are in the government, in the ministries, they don't listen to us. And just to end, and sorry for extending.
That's okay.
Just want to remind you that the wars on anything, wars on drugs, wars on terror, wars on trafficking, have never worked the way they're supposed to be working. They always work all the way around, and it's prejudicial mostly for the most vulnerable part in the equation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and to all the panelists on this panel. Thank you for all of the wisdom. I think we're going to wrap up there. Luca is going to come back to us and let us know if there's any closing words.
Yes, thank you very much to all the panelists and all the chairs. Thank you to all the participants who stayed for the 3-hour-long webinar today. I'll just say a few closing words and then I will let you go for a well-deserved lunch. So this event was really important to us, to sex workers and our organization in the region, because we know that after 20 years of on-demand model, such as the Swedish model, implemented, the result is not what was expected. There is no decrease of sex workers or numbers of victims of trafficking in countries where the model has been implemented. And to the contrary, there's been an increase of violence and vulnerability of sex workers. What we wanted to say is that when we developed this webinar, we questioned ourselves how we would put these panels together. And for us, it was important to put on the same levels sex workers activists, academics with degrees and years of research, experts from Council of Europe, and members of different NGOs. For us, we have the expertise, whether we are sex workers, members of service providers, researchers, etc. And we believe that only by working together, we can get a better picture of what is happening in the sex industry. We think like the main issue currently when it comes to trafficking and exploitation is that we don't have all the information that we need to develop best policies. If you look at France, for example, when the law was proposed to criminalize clients, you had members of parliament supported by anti-trafficking organizations saying that 90% of people in prostitution in France were victims of trafficking, 90%. There is absolutely no evidence behind this number. This number was simply made up and used to push for a law that would criminalize prostitution. And sadly, anti-trafficking organizations supported this law, which now has devastating impact on sex worker communities. During the Trump era, we talk a lot about post-truth era. And it was something that people suddenly realized that people in high position of power could simply lie and get away with it. But for sex workers, this has been the case for as long as we've been fighting. We are fighting a world where we are being told that 90% or every people in sex work are victims of trafficking, and that the only answer is to criminalize or abolish the sex industry. However, we know this is not the truth, and we know that through research led by sex workers or in collaboration with sex workers, we know this by the work done with many other NGOs. So to close this webinar, I actually wanted to extend a call of action to people joining this webinar today. If you are working for an anti-trafficking organization, I think it's really critical that you question the work that you are doing. I believe that everyone that is working in the field of anti-trafficking has the best intention at heart. Maybe you are coming from a human rights perspective, from a faith-based organization, from a feminist perspective, or from a labor rights perspective, and you do believe that it is possible to end violence, exploitation, and trafficking. However, you really have to question if you have been supporting a model that has been proven constantly to be harming the most vulnerable members of the community, is it time to stop supporting this model? And we believe it is possible for people to question themselves and realize, yes, I was wrong, and I can change my point of view, I can change the direction of my organization, and I can now work jointly with marginalized communities, including sex workers, in order to develop better policies and programs. So actually, this webinar with Freedom Collaborative was this example of how anti-trafficking organization or platform can work with sex workers to really bring these sometimes opposing two worlds together. So with these final words, I would really invite everyone, if you are not already in touch with sex worker organizations, to approach them, even if in the past you had differences of opinions. I really believe, today, after such a huge impact of the COVID-19 crisis on sex workers and other marginalized communities, to really learn to speak to one another again and to find solutions that really work for sex workers, in particular migrant sex workers and victims of trafficking. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and please keep in touch. Have a good day.
Thank you, Luca.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.